Now I will introduce to you our guest and our speaker. Rebecca Textor is here with us. Rebecca is a certified prevention specialist serving as the suicide prevention coordinator for DBHDS Region 1. She earned her Master of Prevention Science degree from the University of Oklahoma. Rebecca has worked within the Virginia Community Services Board system since 2010, and prior to that, she was a community health coordinator for Carilion Health System. She began focusing on region-wide suicide prevention in 2015. She is one of the developers of Lock and Talk Virginia, which is a statewide suicide prevention program, and serves as co-lead for the initiative. She is a member of Rockbridge Bath Regional Crisis Intervention Team and the Rockbridge Area Prevention Coalition since 2008, and Virginia Prevention Council since 2010. Rebecca currently serves on the session for Oxford Presbyterian Church in Lexington, Virginia. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here with us.
Hey, Casey. Hi, everybody. I really am so thankful to have the opportunity to share part of your morning and just to talk to you guys about a lot of really interesting material that I've been collecting. And this is really a multi-layered topic that we're going to deal with today. So I really want to talk today about what we're looking at with substance misuse and how it can contribute to suicide risk. And also we'll get into some substance abuse issues and mental health issues that come up. Then in the next layer, we think about what kind of unique situation we have been thrust into during the pandemic. How does this heighten our risks? And then what can you all as faith leaders do to help those who may be suffering during this time period? It's a lot to cover and it's pretty heavy. You know, anytime we start looking at data around substance abuse, mental illness, or suicide, it can bring up some raw emotion for us. So while I recognize the intensity of some of the pieces we're going to cover, what I've decided to do is try to make it a little bit heavier towards the beginning with the information that I give you so you have a background. But then I want to pull you into a place of positivity by the end of this presentation, so we're uplifted. That's the point of you know, our work as prevention specialists, really. And so my hope today is that you're going to have some aha moments the way I have when I've seen a couple of the different models over the summer when we've talked about disaster distress response, for example. I want to help you feel inspired to read and research through some of the links that we have embedded, not only in this presentation, but also in that guide that the Northwestern Prevention Collaborative is providing you with. It's an excellent guide. We've all added to it. And I think you'll have more than your share of nighttime reading, if you'd like, to learn more about anything we discussed today. So be ready for that. My other goal is to send you away with practical tips, things that you can really sink your teeth into. It's one thing to look at the data. It's another thing to say, hey, how am I going to put this to use tomorrow? And so I'm really looking for a practical stance on this. Then really at the end, I'm hoping you guys are all going to feel a lot more confident, even more confident than you already are as helpers to people. And then helping yourself. And I don't mean basic self-care. And you've probably had presentations before in the past about basic self-care. But what I want to talk about too is the trauma response and how you can handle trauma response that you deal with throughout this pandemic and listening to other people's problems. So this is a journey. And I'm going to treat it like that. I'm a very visual person, so I'm going to make us walk through sort of a story as we go. And then at certain times, I'm going to pause as we transition, and we'll ask Casey to you know, bring up a couple of the questions that you sent her in the chat room, and I'll do my best to answer or direct you to where you can find answers. Okay? So let's go ahead and start our slideshow with something you all have probably seen before. Okay, and that is going to be Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maybe you've seen this somewhere along the line in the classroom environment. Abraham Maslow came up with this idea. He posits that human behavior is going to be guided by meeting certain basic needs that we all have. And most frequently, as an infant, you're going to start with the basic physiological needs. Do I have enough to eat? Do I have nourishment? Do I have shelter? And then moving into safety and security. So he's positing that naturally over time, we build upon these needs so that we can reach up through adulthood, through reaching social connectivity with other human beings, companionship, belonging, into esteem needs where we can look at respecting ourselves as well as respecting others, and then into self-actualization, which is really the pinnacle. It's where we want to be, where we recognize our full potential as humans. So, he's always said, gosh, we have to really take care of those basic needs first before we have the brain space to think about the others. So, if you look at his model and you think about where we've been as adults, we may be up here working on our relationships and our social areas, in our STEAM needs. We may be thinking about our life goals and actually reaching that area towards self-actualization. But suddenly the pandemic hit, and now we are really literally thrust back down into thinking about our safety and our security needs. And if you think about it, some of your parishioners or some of your faith base may be even thinking about shelter and nourishment needs. So they may be even thrust into the first base of this pyramid. So this is a shocker. It's a rude awakening for us. But here's what I would like to do. I'd like to challenge all of us. I want to say, Maslow, you're wrong, because we as adults have been working for so many years on building our relationships with others and building relationships with our communities, with our faith community too, that we have all of this in the background, and we can actually dwell in this part here where we're concerned about our safety and security, but also reach up to what we've already learned through our relationships and build on it and exist, even though we're in a scary place in time. So in order to prove him wrong, what we're really going to have to do is we're going to have to do a lot of hard work, and it's going to be a lot of hard work on our wellness. This is what I'm talking about here. And I'm talking about our wellness as seen as a whole, as seen as the wheel. I'm not talking about just getting by, because we can do that, right? We can just skate by. Many people do. But what about thriving? I challenge us to think about how we can help ourselves and help our faith base thrive and come out on the other end of the pandemic as stronger, more resilient individuals. And I believe what it takes is literally looking at each wedge of your wheel. Now, you're going to see this wellness wheel all over the internet. It was originally based off of the Native American spirit wheel or wellness wheel. In the 70s, it was taken to new levels here, and they started to tailor it to different audiences. For example, the one that I've pulled here for you is great for showing to young people. Okay. Each of the sections that we look at about what makes us healthy and well as individuals, the information in each chunk is tailored towards what a young person would be thinking of at that stage in their life. There are wheels out there for people who are professionals or specifically college students. You can find any number of them. Every once in a while, I take inventory for myself of my wellness wheel. I try to see if I have balanced my emotional health with my spiritual and social health, for example. How well am I doing in each of these areas? Now, during the pandemic, it's a lot more intense because every single chunk seems to need some work right now. If you think about it, a lot of people in your faith base, including you and me, we're dealing with special challenges. Think about the financial woes of individuals who've been laid off during this time period, maybe have lost their position entirely, and they're struggling to figure out what their financial health is going to look like so that they can keep a safe and comfortable environment for their families, for example. That crosses over into the environmental piece, right? The social piece, we are supposed to have social distancing. I challenge us not to social distance, but simply physical distance. I want to rename that entirely. I think other folks are starting to pick up on that now too, because we need our social connectivity right now, whether it's on technology or wearing a mask or being 6 feet apart. Our social health is important. We need to stay connected to those that we care about in whatever ring of community, whether it's our internal family, our neighborhood, our faith community, our larger community, our country. Our physical health is an obvious issue right now. We're trying to protect ourselves from a very real physical illness. When we think about our emotional health, crosses over all of these pieces. Our intellectual health could be suffering for adults. You know, we reach out to learn more, oftentimes through clubs and activities outside of our outside of our home, and we're limited in that now. Imagine our children. A lot of them are not in a school area where they have been taken out of an environment of learning that they're used to. So they could be struggling in this way. Spiritually, we've had challenges where many of us have not been able to gather the same way that we used to. And this is a big deal. All of these things mixed together is what really makes us able to thrive as humans and then fulfill that higher pinnacle that, you know, that Maslow is talking about, that fulfilling your potential as a human being. So when I think about it, when I think of summertime and I think of this particular wheel, I do a lot of floating on our river in Rockbridge County on the Maury River. And I think about being in my inner tube. So let's picture this. I put myself as the individual into the center of my inner tube, my wellness wheel. Floating on that beautiful river and being able to observe the wildlife around me, the sun shining through the trees, listening to the water. That to me is abundant life. That's the joy that I'm striving for as a well person, right? But you know, some of these rafts that we get these days, you know, they come in a box and you blow up sections of them at a time, like one piece is a pillow and another piece is the body part. Let's pretend that my wellness wheel is a raft and each of these wedges has a place that you blow up, okay? So in order to float down my river and feel as good as I am able to feel, I need to have air in every section. Okay, if I start losing air in any of these sections, I'm not going to get down that river as easily. So I don't want to get stuck on the rocks. And the pandemic hit, And it's as if rocks, I'm going over a lot of rocks in the river, and they're puncturing the different aspects of my raft. Now, I could struggle, in a small whirlpool with a flat raft, and yeah, I'll be getting by. But how do I get that raft healthy again so I can get back down that river and come out on the other side? Here's what we may be missing when we're missing the full potential of our spiritual health. When we're missing out on our faith gatherings, for example, we could be missing that time that we take as a community to express gratitude and love for each other, love for a higher power. We miss out on a sense of breathing deep and getting to a place of calm and introspection. So if you think about it, for those of us who sing hymns, if you think about a moment when you're panicked in your life, you're breathing quickly, right? You're breathing quicker in that mode of stress. You wouldn't be able to sing your best through a hymn, would you? So oftentimes when you're missing out on a faith gathering, for us, we miss out on song. Okay? We also miss touching, caring, sharing, and togetherness. These are very real pieces that help our social health as part of our spiritual health and our emotional health. We miss out on that faith leader's guidance that we look forward to perhaps once, twice, few times a week, where we have that focused time to process our concerns, our life concerns, look for guidance, and work through conversations even with each other. Now, one thing I will say is that there has been so much more potential now. My pastor has started putting his sermons on YouTube and has actually gained an even wider audience. So I think there are some good things coming out of it now. But there are still aspects that are different, and we are struggling. One thing that caught my attention, this is my aha moment for the summer, okay? I was watching a presentation recently, and it was put on by the National Council for Behavioral Health. And they were really talking a lot about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's a hotline for individuals who may be experiencing a crisis, but they also are the same folks that cover the calls for our National Distress Helpline. I don't know if you ever knew that we had a National Distress Helpline, but when you're experiencing a natural disaster, such as this pandemic, there's actually a call center when you're not, specifically suicidal, but you're concerned about, the distress that you're experiencing during this pandemic, for example. So SAMHSA has this model, and it really showed me how things have been going down for so many of us. It showed me that there is a sense of grief and loss that we are working through. That is very much like the grief and loss of a loved one. Now, granted too, that some of us are losing loved ones to COVID-19. So we keep that in mind. That's a double whammy. You're losing a sense of freedom that you've had, prior to the pandemic. And now you're dealing with other loss as well. So let's look at this on the left-hand side. Up here on the arrow, we have the emotional highs that we feel in life. At the bottom, let's think of that as despair, okay? Most of us at the beginning, back in, say, February, we were living kind of this norm. We were skating along, pre-disaster mode. We're doing okay. We had our ups and downs, but we were doing okay. Then came this warning that something was going on in China. boom, we're brought down to this, what does that mean for us? And we started to worry a little bit. But time passed, we thought about it, but nothing specific had happened. Bam, we're threatened by the fact that cases have started to come into the United States. And now we're thinking about having talks with our family. What does it mean to be in a pandemic? What might change for us? Do we need to go out and buy supplies? Do you remember that back in March when there was no toilet paper? That's where we were. Then slowly we wait. And so we kind of move our way slowly back up to a not quite to normal, but just seeing what happens. And then there's the impact. Our cases are starting to increase in our country, and now begins the roller coaster. Did you all notice this stage that some of us have gotten to where we almost felt heroic? I will say in my family, I did get this sense of, hey guys, we can get through this. We're tough. I have 2 weeks worth of dinners in the freezer in case we get sick. Well, it lasted a lot longer than 2 weeks, let me tell you. But for that short period of time, my basic stress response, and I know you guys talked about this in your last presentation in this series, that's basic stress response of flight or freeze response. We fought, we pulled together what we needed, and we felt a little bit perhaps heroic. Then we recognized this community cohesion. There was a time in my community towards the beginning, let's say in April, I noticed in my community, signs went up. Thank you, first responders. Thank you, medical care providers. This is a sense of, spreading the love around our community. We call it the honeymoon period. Then our emotions started changing. We came to what I'm going to call a crossroads, where we recognize that, yes, we're tough, we can be strong, and we can spread our love to one another and support one another. And we can check in with our neighbors, but there's also this emotion that we're feeling, and it's disillusionment, it's disappointment that this virus is not going away quickly. Okay, so here we are in our ups and downs, our peaks and valleys. What we know, folks, is that we are going to get through this grief process, and that's what our hopeful and blue arrow on the right is looking like. Okay. Yes, we may have anniversary reactions. If you think about the anniversary of someone's death that was close to you, we're going to look back and remember the things that just aren't ever going to be the same. There's going to be a new normal, right? We may have feelings of sadness about that at some point. But then we're going to keep moving forward, working through that grief. We may have a setback. And how could that look for us? This could even be, say, another personal illness that we experience in our life in the future. And it may bring us a little more fear than maybe it would have in the past. Maybe we're catching a strain of flu that is much less dangerous, for example, but we are afraid because of the history we've had with this COVID-19 experience. But then we will come out on the other side. This reconstruction period will happen. And then there will be, again, this leveling off. It may be not the same level as pre-disaster, may look different, but it will level off. So I want to remind you to remind your faith base that we will get through this, but that these experiences in the emotional response to disaster are natural, normal feelings. Okay, now this is some news that is, I think, where we get a little heavy. It's tough to hear, but in mid-May, a report came out from the Wellbeing Trust and Robert Graham Center for Policy Studies in Family Medicine and Primary Care. This was a study that if you want to look at all the background to it, please do click on the link at another time and read all about what they came up with. But their prediction is that we could lose additional 75,000 people from drug or alcohol misuse and suicide after the emergence of COVID-19 and the stress that is attached to it. What I take away from Jack Westfall when he says we should strive to provide as much certainty as possible through all this, what I take away from that is that, number one, we need to let our faith base know that addiction is preventable. We can also provide the education surrounding that. And we also want our faith base to understand that suicide can be preventable. Most suicides are preventable. So what we want to do is present that education to them as best we can, whether it's electronically right now or what have you, but get the education to them on both suicide prevention and also substance abuse prevention. It's important to know the history of this, the connection, and the impact in your particular area. So I'm going to talk about your catchment as well. Number two, the other certainties that I would like to impart is that when we store lethal means safely and smartly in our homes, it's proven to reduce suicides. Let people know this. It's the core of the Lock and Talk Virginia message that we deliver in our suicide prevention campaigning. So I also will talk about that today. But this, you guys, is an important step that Dr. Westfall's talking about in providing certainty in uncertain times, providing certain things that you can give your faith base to bring them hope. With these, with the expected increases in what he calls, and what you will see called deaths of despair, Dr. Westfall also says we must also make our relationships certain, regardless of the uncertain facts and figures of the day. What does that mean to me? When I read that, it means two things for our faith community. Number one, to our faith base, it means making our commitment known to each other, to our congregations, for example, to our groups. It also means making open the tougher conversations, listening purposefully to the folks that you help, connect them to trusted resources. Okay, so that's the part two of this, is connecting people to resources. Make sure that we learn what the relationships are, for example, between your community services board and your law enforcement and your local health center. I'll give you one single example that will help you see these relationships. CIT, or crisis intervention teams in your area. You have them in every part of Virginia, including Northwestern Virginia. That means that law enforcement will be connected to the community service board person who is going to assess the crisis situation and then possibly work with your local primary care hospital and maybe get inpatient services for someone. They're all working together. Here's an example later on in this presentation. You'll see how talking to someone and connecting them to resources can be a huge key in helping them feel more comfortable working through a crisis. For example, letting someone on a 911 call who, for someone who might be considering suicide, letting that person on the other end of the line know that you may need a CIT trained officer come to the scene so that they are schooled in how to work through a mental health crisis with a softer hand. Okay, that's one example. If you want to read more about the particular Wellbeing Trust article and our thoughts on this, you can check it out on lockandtalk.org, our website, or look at their full report through these links. So as I said, Dr. Westphal wants you to know a little bit of the history, right? So the history before our pandemic circumstance, we in 2018 lost over 47,000 people in this country to suicide. In 2018, whether it be prescription drug abuse or illicit drug abuse, we lost over 67,000 individuals in this country to drug overdoses. Some may have been suicides, or intentional or not, but that's kind of the history before the pandemic. We also know that we have are looking at a case where 7.7 million adults in the U.S. are dealing with two things: a mental health disorder and an addiction. That's a double whammy that they have to deal with. And in 2018 in this country, we were looking at a suicide rate of 14.2 per 100,000 individuals. Now, if you think about that prediction that Dr. Westphal talks about, the increase, we're looking at a pretty scary number of people who will be affected. In your catchment, for example, I do want to give you the history, just the local background of what we had in 2018. This is brand new data that came out last month from VDH. This is the suicide rate for the 2018 data in Shenandoah, Frederick, Page, Warren, and Clark counties. So if you see that across the country, the same time the rate was a 14.2 per 100,000, you'll notice that a few of your counties are in a higher bracket than the national rate, okay? This just gives you a little bit of the background. If you want to see more of the underlying circumstances of suicides and what they have found in your area, you can find that through the VDH website, okay? And more national data if you'd like. Significant findings from that 2018 report that I want to bring up. So this hones in again on the circumstances that we were starting with pre-COVID. From 2014 to 2018 in Virginia, we saw a 54% increase in strangulation as a method. So we're looking at suffocation, hangings, for example, in Virginia. So we want to think about that in terms of protecting lethal means. We'll talk about that later in the presentation of a couple of ways to think about securing means for strangulation so that if someone's in crisis, you can keep them safe. We also saw an 18% increase in firearms used as a method to die by suicide. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at 85% of our suicide deaths in Virginia were Caucasian, 77% were male. Looking at a lot of middle-aged individuals. 1 in 5 are currently in the armed forces or have been in the armed forces. Now, I know that we have a large military population in the state of Virginia, but this is something to consider. They tend to have more access to firearms or have them in the home. Think about, when you look at this data, think about interconnectivity. What do the individuals in your faith base have in common? And what might they be dealing with? We also noticed that there are very young ladies, our middle school age ladies are presenting with more suicide thoughts than the boys. And then boys and ladies alike, when you get into the teen years, are having higher thoughts of suicide and even suicide behavior. There's a youth behavioral health survey that you can look at to see what the rates would be in your area. I encourage you to do that if you're interested. The other piece of this to keep in mind is that when they looked at the individuals who were in Virginia hospitals in the ER after a suicide attempt. 7 out of 10 were 44 and younger. Okay, so any preconceived notions you may have about suicide or who could be vulnerable, remember that this is what you're looking at in Virginia just before the pandemic. So with this huge roller coaster we're on, I want to stop and see if we have questions so far, Casey.
We do have one question, and this came when you were talking about the deaths related to substance use and suicide during the time of this pandemic. And the question was, are these deaths in addition to the deaths that will occur from substance overdose outside the pandemic?
So if we're looking at the report from the Dr. Westfall's report, yes, they're saying above that.
Okay.
And I think that's a frightening number. Now, what I do want to say though, you guys, is that we can fight this. And I think part of the reason why this report came out in May is so that we can start building building bridges now so that we can stave that off. I never want to see that number get higher. We likely will see an increase in suicides. I know that we have seen just in some of the call centers an increase in calls for suicide thoughts from particularly younger folks, and they've had more access to methods within their homes because they're stuck in their homes and they're more isolated these days. So, we're going to do everything in our power through best practices and reaching out to people to make sure that that number does not get that high. And if they want to,
that was our question.
Okay, all right. So let's just see now, because I bet the next question that people are wondering is about drug use. Where does this come into the picture? How are we going to connect it to the suicide thoughts? And I want to add here that, yes, folks, it's easy to forget alcohol's a drug. It may be socially acceptable in most circles, but we have to remember that it's also a drug, and it's a sneaky drug. So for that reason, because alcoholism can sneak up on people, I'm going to start with that one in this next slide. So this is the SBIRT model, but I built upon it just to illustrate my point here. It's the continuum of substance use. So this is a model that might be used to explain to someone in a brief intervention what it looks like going from a safer or no use of, say, alcohol in this particular example, and moving into problem areas of drinking where you can go work your way into a substance use disorder and addiction. And, obviously, and I pulled abstinence straight out of the picture. Abstinence is in itself the safest. It's not even in the model, in my opinion. If you're not drinking, we don't have to worry about this. But we move into experimentation and social drinking. That's one thing. But when you see these get bold, the binge drinking, problem drinking, and substance use disorder, this is where we start to get concerned. I saw a recent report that alcohol is a marketing report, but they were saying that Bloomberg was saying, alcohol sales are down, therefore people are drinking less. Well, they're drinking less in bars and, socially, but what kind of drinking are they doing during the pandemic? Many people use substances like alcohol to cope with life stressors. So let's say what had been a safe use of alcohol in the past can become an issue if you start increasing drinking at home while you're isolated. So we have to just keep a check on this. You may have people in your faith base who are concerned about a spouse drinking more in the evenings, for example, or they're laid off. They're drinking more during the afternoon hours, for example, on days when they normally wouldn't have been. This is the kind of thing that can creep up on you. It can become, I'm not saying it always will, but could become problem drinking. And Unfortunately, there is an increased risk for developing a mental illness or depression, for example, from this, because it is a depressant. And when you're isolated, you can be more prone to depression or additional disease. Let's think about substance use disorders and the diseases that people have to manage when they're dealing with addiction, even above and beyond the addiction itself, like liver failure, kidney failure. So we really want to stave off higher risk of early death here. Okay, so let's think about all drugs now, not just alcohol, but whether we're maybe using more prescription drugs or recreational drugs, whether it's to cope or what have you. Individuals with substance use disorders, that's the SUD piece in here, they're unfortunately twice as likely to have a mood or anxiety disorder. SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, puts out a lot of data that combines these topics. They talk about mental health and substance abuse together. So they also say that half of individuals with mental illnesses will have an SUD in their lifetime. And that's a big struggle. Chronic pain sufferers who are often prescribed opioids to deal with that pain may also have comorbid depression. Comorbid meaning side by side. They're dealing with depressive illness and then also that pain and possibly an opioid addiction. So we have to work against that. I know it's going to feel like you're swimming against the tide here, but there is light at the end of this tunnel. 20 to 30% they have found of the overdose deaths are actually suicides. Okay. Many of the overdoses among individuals without an explicit intent to die, they may not be saying, to themselves, I am suicidal, but they might be saying, let fate take the wheel. They might be saying, whatever happens, happens at this point. I'm out of control. They're not caring about the risk anymore. Up to 40% of the lethal or non-lethal suicide attempts actually involve alcohol intoxication. This could be by itself or in addition to, say, a prescription or other drug that they're using at the time. I add this one to the end because alcohol plays this kind of tack-on role when it comes to suicide risk. Why? Because it increases your aggressiveness. Alcohol impairs your judgment. Think about how it could increase the aggressiveness to be violent to oneself, for example, to actually take the action to make an attempt of suicide. So it's constricting your cognition. It impairs your ability to come up with a healthier alternative to cope with the problems you're facing. So think about this as an extra issue. Now, the suicide rate among those with an opioid use disorder is 6 times the rate of the general population. Sit on that one for a moment. If you have anyone in your faith base who is addicted to opioids, they are at higher risk for suicide. So they're 40 to 60% more likely to have those thoughts, and 75% more likely to make suicide plans and attempt. Okay, I want you to think about the opioid misuse and suicide connection. Now, I've just shown you a lot of data, and it's heavy. Let's connect a face to that data. And when I thought about who to choose for this, I immediately thought of Dr. Lloyd, because he is a case where, okay, he exemplifies someone who went through a serious opioid addiction, came out the other side, and he came out healthy, and he came out to help other people. Okay, so here's a positive case.
My name is Stephen Lloyd. I'm the acting chief of medicine and the associate chief for staff for education at the Mountain Home VA. 10 years ago, I was addicted to prescription narcotics myself. I was using about 500 milligrams of opiates a day, in addition to a lot of benzodiazepines, mainly Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, and had basically thought my life was over at that point. I went to bed half the nights praying that I wouldn't die of an overdose and the other half praying that I would. And I got help and realized because of my role as an associate professor in a medical school that I could have an impact on trainees, mainly medical students and residents who get little to no training on either addiction or prescribing narcotics.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Everybody looks at so-called pill mills or doctors that write the drugs freely. The majority of people are first-time use, get it out of mine and your medicine.
Okay. What I want folks to keep in mind is that they can see the rest of Dr. Lloyd's interview. There are several online, actually, that are wonderful. He's a fantastic speaker, and we're going to bring him in August for a virtual training on this topic. But I really like him because he's an example of coming out on the other side victorious and being able to help other people and get to that pinnacle and, you know, reach his human potential. Did you notice what he prays for? You know, when he was suffering, some nights he went to bed praying to die and others praying that he wouldn't. So right there, I want to tell you, there is that connection between the addiction issues, the misuse issues with substances of all kinds, and suicide thoughts and behaviors. Now, when we think about the biggest question people want to know, particularly after a suicide death, is why people are dying by suicide. What is that toxic mix of thoughts and feelings and circumstances that happen? Dr. Thomas Joyner has one of the most excellent books you could ever possibly want to read on this topic. He is the key researcher in this field. This book you can buy online pretty cheaply these days. It's called Why People Die by Suicide. He talks in his research about this idea of perceived burdensomeness, feeling like you're a burden to your family or friends or to your community, for example. But it's perceived. It's their perception of feeling like a burden. And then also a sense of failed belongingness. What's happening right now in this time period? Some people are feeling like more of a burden to their families, to their friends, to their communities. And that's a sad place to be, particularly if they're struggling with an addiction. But also, they could be detached, isolated. So that feeling of belongingness is suffering for many of us, okay? And we need to fight that. Then there's also this idea here, this perfect storm that he talks about is the capability of acting on suicide thoughts. What does he mean by that? He means getting over the fear of using a lethal means on oneself. So breaking that barrier of fear to inflict harm on oneself, and also having ready access to that lethal means itself. Those two coming together can either precipitate a serious attempt or death by suicide. Keep that in mind, because if we can fight both of these fronts, we can help prevent suicide. At this point, I'm going to get into all of the positivity, how we can help our faith base. Do I have any questions, Casey, before I get started on this part?
Nope, no questions yet.
Okay. So guys, how do we help? I bet you're wondering. Not going to leave you in a bad space here. There are three big things we want to talk about. One, help build community resiliency. Okay. How we bounce back in the face of adversity. We want to help our faith base do that. Two, we want to watch, be ready to see the signs of despair in anyone in our faith base. And then we want to spread the word clear and simply as possible about lethal means safety. These are all very concrete pieces. Let's start with building community resiliency, okay? I want you to think of it in two ways: your formal and your informal resources in your area. So let's get down to Northwest Virginia, for example. Let's think about your informal resources, like your faith, your church community itself. Let's think about formal resources, like, for example, your community services board or any number of hotlines, okay? I want to make sure that you're using the resources that are available at your fingertips right now, because if you have internet service, we can get things to folks. Use lockandtalk.org. This is a brand new website we have for our program. I encourage you to look at the resources tab. It's divided for individuals who need help, for families and friends, for professionals just like you who want to learn more about helping other people. It has help there for media. It's all there. So use the website as a resource. In addition, I really hope with all my heart that you're going to get some education for your faith base on topics that combine substance use and abuse prevention and suicide prevention. If your folks don't have internet service, print the PDFs and do a mailing. I don't know, get creative, but let's do it. Let's have phone calls with our faith-based members. You know, anything we can do to get the word out right now and get people educated. But be a part of webinars like this. Also, too, I want you to think about passing along crisis lines. Like, for example, you have a lot of young people at home right now. If they're starting to feel like they're, you know, a mental health crisis is emerging, or they're suicidal, sometimes it's tough to pick up a phone and actually talk to someone, particularly if you're crying in distress. You may be more willing, and a young person often is, to text 741-741 and start the brief intervention that way. Okay, there's also the suicide prevention Lifeline and the disaster distress hotline. So any of these are good. The disaster distress hotline definitely during the pandemic is good for people to utilize as well. Any of your parishioners can use this. Also, I want you to think about specific needs. If there are crisis lines that suit the specific needs of an individual you're trying to help, you may need the National Child Abuse Hotline, domestic violence hotline. Anything like this you see in the left column, make use of that as well. Pass it on. There's never been a more important time to do this. Unfortunately, there is an increase in domestic violence in the home right now because so many people are isolated and under such extreme stress. So I encourage you to keep these things in mind when you listen to people's stories and what they're dealing with. That part 2 of helping your parishioners, helping your faith base, is really about watching for possible suicide thoughts. Now, the ones that I have bolded in the top here, these are obvious ones, right? I mean, it's great if somebody actually really tells us flat out what they're thinking, that they are really thinking of killing oneself, or they've made serious plans and preparations. If they tell us that, we know they need help right away. It's a 911, have a CIT trained officer on the scene, get them help. So yes, these obvious signs are one thing, but more often than not, we have some listening to do. Oftentimes, if they are feeling suicidal, they may be giving you hints. They may be telling you about, for example, these signs, like having problems with insomnia, intense anxiety, pain that's emotional or actual physical. Some people feel physical pain from this kind of intense stress. feeling desperate or trapped. Sometimes they talk about feeling out of control, helpless or hopeless. They may express in different ways that they have no reason or purpose to live. This is regardless of whether or not you can say, hey guys, you do have a reason. You do have reasons. We love you. We're here. This is their perception right now, and this is that black hole that they're in. So we have to really respect where they are and see that place of pain. They may express it in ways that aren't exactly inviting to us. They may have rage or anger. They may be getting into fights with their spouse more frequently. That can be hard to understand. They could be acting more reckless, being risky, not adhering to safety measures during this pandemic. And then you'll see, of course, on this list, increase of drug and alcohol use for coping. Again, there's a connection. And then withdrawing from friends and family, becoming even more isolated. Okay, now there's another piece to this that I want you to keep in mind during this pandemic. These almost exactly mirror the disaster and trauma responses that human beings have. So during a pandemic, people may be experiencing any range of these feelings or emotions, and it might be about the trauma. However, it is our job as faith leaders to ask deeper questions. What is the extent of your pain right now? Does it make you feel suicidal? And don't be afraid to ask, what is the extent of your pain? Because it's the only way you're going to know how to really help someone. Because truly, if it's about substance use or substance addiction, then you'll get them that kind of help. If it's about suicide, you'll get them that help. So you need to ask more questions. Now, the next piece, the number 3 on my list, is super tangible, you guys. You can call Shannon Urum or Rebecca, any of the folks on the coalition that have sponsored this, and actually get free devices for parishioners who need to lock up medications or need trigger locks or cable locks for their firearms in their household. Many of us have firearms in our household. It is now in Virginia, we are seeing an increase in firearms sales during this summer for various reasons. And I think it's important for us to remind folks to lock them and lock all of them. Okay? So our Lock and Talk program will help the coalitions offer these items for free, but also talk to them about why it's important to lock your meds, lock your guns, and talk safety. The research that our whole program is built on is thanks to Dr. Barber, whose reference is down at the bottom of this slide. She's with the Harvard School of Public Health. She found that if a person cannot easily obtain highly fatal means, they're less likely to use a less fatal method. In other words, they're finding that oftentimes if you take, say, a firearm out of the picture, they don't attempt with another means, or they use something much less fatal, like an amount of an over-the-counter drug that is not as deadly. This is a very key thing that can save lives. Getting back to that data we saw earlier about the use of firearms in attempts going up in this state in 2018, you want to keep that in mind when we think about how important lethal means safety is. Reducing the availability of the common methods has in other countries literally reduced their suicide rates 30 to 50%. That's exciting news. There's a lot more out there. There are stories about what they've done in places in Europe that you might find interesting. But it's important to know too that over time, when they have gone back to attempt survivors, they're realizing they don't go on to die by suicide later. And most of them will say, I am glad that I did not die by suicide at that time in my life. Many people, while some are planned, many people decide in a moment of despair and would have changed their mind. So think about that. This is a method that works. Now, I've talked about the lock and talk part. What does the talk part sound like? Because this is the part that you have a huge role in. Like I said, we have to know what we're dealing with here. So ask the person that you're concerned about directly. I have seen, tell them what you've seen. I have seen these signs, these things that are concerning to me, and I care about you. I need to know how bad your pain is. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Don't be afraid to ask clearly and directly. We'll never know what we're dealing with unless we do. We're not going to plant that seed in someone's mind. that is an old myth that we're trying to debunk at this point. It is a crisis of non-communication and despair. Okay? You can provide hope by opening that door to conversation. Now, the next piece of this, the next piece of talking is actually about listening, not arguing them out of suicide. You know, certainly we could say, how would your friends and family feel if you were gone? The guilt doesn't work. They're already feeling guilty and probably pretty bad about themselves at this point. They're feeling burdensome as it is. So we have found that guilting them out of suicide attempts does not work. But instead, let them know you care, that they're not alone, and that their symptoms can be treated. If they're depressed, if they're also dealing with a substance use issue, hey, we can connect you to care. You can recover. We can work on this together. Now, the connect person to care is the next part about talking to them. And really big piece of this is don't overpromise. Don't promise something that you personally cannot deliver, but make the connection and spread that net wide. Don't rely on yourself to be the one and only contact that that person has. And if a person is suicidal, make sure you find a way for that person not to be alone right now while they're actively suicidal. These are very important pieces that I hope you will keep in your desk drawer, stuffed away for those moments when you're in panic mode and trying to help someone you care about in your congregation, for example. Really, folks, the conversation can be very similar for someone who's misusing substances. If you're worried about addiction, let's say you have a spouse in your congregation call you and say, I'm concerned. You can coach them on how to have this talk, asking them clearly and directly, why are you drinking more? Are you feeling despair? Are you feeling this time during the pandemic is too much for you? Is it possibly why you've been using substances more? And then listen to what they have to say and connect them to care, okay? So this is not just about suicide prevention specifically. These are good conversation starters all the way around. Another thing I really, really, really would love for you guys to do is to take advantage of something we worked really hard on over the last 2 years, and that is the Virginia Suicide Prevention Resource Directory. The suicide prevention resource group, we've pulled together folks from VDH, DBHDS, Veterans Affairs, Department of Education. All these folks came together. We gleaned our guide that we had from 2016, put up new contacts, took out ones that are dead links, and now we have a brand new directory for you, all about suicide prevention resources. Use it. This is going to be connected to your guide at the end of the presentation. One thing that this guide will tell you is that a good referral is gold. Passing along a phone number to someone in distress is not enough. It's not going to work necessarily. It may. But many people who are really in pain have a hard time reaching out. So they need a little coaching, they need a little extra help. Listening actively to understand what their problem is and what their needs are is going to be so helpful, because then you can sort of, glean through the types of hotline connections that they might need, the types of therapy that they might be interested in, what's worked for them in the past, versus what has not. Think about that and cast that net widely, okay? Nudge them to actually take the action. That's an important piece of this. And part of it is by saying, hey, I'm going to follow up with you and see how things went. It's okay to do that. A common mistake that people make is dropping the ball. They don't check in afterwards to see if the person's followed through. Maybe they weren't able to get through the first couple of times and they gave up. Can you help along the way? In fact, can you help them think about the very first words they'll say? If they make a phone call to reach out for professional help, can you make that call with them? These are all very practical things that you can do that mean the world to someone who is in despair. I want to make sure that you have access to substance abuse resources in your specific area. This slide will be available to you afterwards. There's all live links here. Are there any questions for us at this point?
Nope, I don't have any that have been sent to me yet.
Okay.
Open the floor in a few minutes once your presentation is done.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Casey. I'm switching gears now. What if a suicide happens? Someone in your faith base has died by suicide. You may have had to deal with this in the past. It can be very, very painful for all of those who have survived the suicide, for the family members directly affected, for you as the leader of this congregation, for example. We really wanted to help the faith community with this, so we came up with a tip sheet for some basic tips based on an old SPRC and national resource that came out years ago. But we have upgraded it, updated it, and it's on the lockandtalk.org website. And it's under resources for professionals such as yourselves. This is tips for giving a religious service after a suicide. And I think that you will have some takeaways from that. Your pastoral care will help immensely. How you handle the situation is critical right after a death like this. If during or after the pandemic you have to deal with something of this magnitude, let's consider this. Consider comfort for the grieving. They're going to be on that roller coaster that looks like that emotional response to disaster that we saw earlier today. One thing that I like to convey to people is that the memory that you have of someone you've lost to suicide does not have to be focused around the memory of their method or the circumstances surrounding their death. It can be about your history with that person, what made them the person that you loved, what made them special. So I encourage you, if you're going to memorialize someone in the immediate after, or with the immediate after effects of a suicide, to really talk about who they were and not the circumstances by which they died. Help survivors of the suicide reduce feelings of guilt. Sometimes it's a natural process. They may go through anger too. Help them understand that the anger is natural. It's a natural grief response and that it will subside eventually, but we're going to go on this roller coaster together. Recognize too, and help them recognize that the grief from a suicide loss is way more complex than any other kind of death, because there's always that why. It's in the way of the death itself. It's about the immediacy of it. It's about the reasoning behind it, the uncomfortability of it, and trying to understand the immense amount of pain that someone might have been going through, or, for example, a mental illness that they might have been struggling with, or substance use issue at that time. And please assure those who are survivors of this loss that everyone's timeline to grieve a suicide loss is different and acceptable. People can even feel guilty about when, how long, how they grieve after a suicide. I know this may sound odd. Maybe not. Maybe you've experienced this in your faith base before, but losing someone to suicide can make an individual more at risk for suicide themselves. This has happened in my immediate family over the last 2 years. I can tell you that it's a terrible thing to recognize that there is an increased risk for other suicides when you have one happen in your faith base. So really demystifying mental illness, demystifying suicide actions is important, not glamorizing a sense of peace that someone would feel after a suicide death, but also not saying what a horrible, awful person they were for dying by suicide. You got to strike a balance here for your folks, so that the people who are left behind, so that they feel like you're being sensitive to their needs in healing as well. So just focus on what the person was to the congregation itself as a whole. Please also remember that suicide doesn't often happen for one single reason. It's usually very complex. While there might be a tipping point or one factor that pushes someone to the attempt, usually there are a multitude of reasons that build up. And one of the things that we say is that it's very important to do this, because if you say there's a single reason for a particular suicide, someone who's vulnerable might think, I'm also at risk because I have that same thing going on in my life, or that same attribute that person had. So therefore, I am at suicide risk. Everyone is individual. Every group of reasons for suicide is based on the individual's resiliency, on their circumstance, and on their support system around them. Okay, so we want to use language that's sensitive during a service like this. We even shy away from the words committed suicide. We don't want someone to attribute it to committing a crime, but say die by suicide, and that this is something that is an unfortunate experience, but they have died by suicide or killed oneself. All right. Casey, are there any questions?
Yes, we're actually getting some really good questions.
Yay!
Yeah, someone said, these are great ideas. Do you have any other suggestions for individuals who have grown up in a church that has very strong opinions on suicide being a sin, to help change the conversation to one of hope instead of judgment and guilt?
Yes, and you know what the very first thing that comes to my mind is, read the scripture list at the end that's attached to the resources with this presentation. Shannon Urum and the coalition folks have put together the guide. We've all added to it. There is a fantastic scripture list beginning with Jeremiah that will help you in having a conversation about suicide. I think you're going to find a huge piece, a lot of comfort in that. I hope it helps, Casey.
That's great. Yeah, it's a beautiful list of scripture. And so everyone will tell you how to get access to that at the end. Actually, I think Shannon's already sent it in the chat.
Oh, good.
We have another question here. Are there additional trainings you can suggest that might be beneficial for faith groups to offer their parishioners, in addition to some of the resources you've already shared?
I sure do. In fact, if you go to lockandtalk.org, the website that we have linked in this presentation in several spots, including the very end, there's even an event calendar that shows a very good summary of all of the mental health workshops that we can offer throughout your catchment, actually across the state at this point, like adult mental health first aid, youth mental health first aid, assist, which is about a suicide intervention, safe talk, which is about having that brief intervention and having suicide awareness. We have several things we can offer, even a lethal means safety talk that's about 30 minutes long. So going to the events tab on the website, you can get to it. Anybody within the prevention services at Northwestern, like Shannon, for example, will be able to hook you up with any of these free workshops, maybe even able to host one for your faith base or for your church, okay? So keep that in mind. We can come to you.
Great. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to save some of these questions until the end and let you wrap up.
Okay, excellent. You guys, this is the next important piece. I want to play this video for you. It's also on our website. This is for all of you out there who are dealing with other people's trauma on a daily basis, and specifically around suicides that may happen within a congregation. Let's take a look.
Study or fellowship groups, youth groups, or service projects. Our role also involves helping people navigate times of personal challenge, as well as issues around death and dying. Scientific research shows that within faith communities, persons in distress or dealing with a mental illness, and those who love and care for them, may first seek out a faith leader for support more often than a mental health provider.
Because of the nature of our work, we are often on the front line when someone has died by suicide. Along with the police or EMTs, we may be among the first people a family member calls. And like other first responders, we are often called to face the raw grief of loved ones, and sometimes even the direct trauma of the death.
Our job as faith leaders doesn't end there. We may be asked to continue to provide care for family members and other loved ones as their grief journey unfolds. Suicide can leave a wake of devastation and a range of complicated emotions among lost survivors. These emotions include shock, despair, and anger at the person who has died, at God, and even at us as faith leaders. Others in our congregations may be suffering as well and may be unsure as how to interact with the immediate family.
Grief after suicide can leave faithful people scared and confused about their faith. It can raise questions like, is suicide a sin? Will my loved one be punished? Why did God abandon my loved one, my parent, sister, brother, child, spouse, friend, a member of my congregation? Does God still love them? Does God still love me?
Preparing a suicide funeral with family members and friends brings additional challenges. Family members may disagree over acknowledging the death as a suicide. In some cases, they may disagree about whether the word suicide can even be mentioned during the service.
As we care for others in their grief journey,
we also struggle with our own ambivalence and response to the suicide. If you know the congregant well, we might critique or replay our interactions and wonder what we could have said or done before the suicide. You may have feelings of guilt and regret for missing warning signs, for downplaying calls for help. You may feel a sense of failure as a faith leader.
Creating a safe haven for the full range of emotions that arise for families and congregations after a suicide allows survivors of loss to begin a healthy grief journey. To facilitate these healing conversations well, it's important that as faith leaders, we are deliberate about our own self-awareness and self-care. To be able to care for others, we as faith leaders must also care for ourselves.
What are some specific things that we can do? 1, know ourselves and the way stress and grief affect us, even before we are faced with a crisis. What are our own experiences of dealing with loss and death? Do you know someone who died by suicide? Were you able to find help for your feelings of grief? Are you aware of the ways that you remember and experience the loss, especially how you think about the suicide? Are you aware of ways you may feel re-traumatized by a suicide?
2, give ourselves permission to get the help we need to deal with our own burdens or the burdens we carry for others. That may be with a therapist or pastoral counselor, a support group, a trusted friend or colleague. In the immediate aftermath of a suicide, we may not be ready to talk. It's okay to want silence and solitude. But grief can be isolating, and we who are listeners also need to have people who listen to us. Some of the greatest faith leaders, like Moses, Deborah, and Elijah, needed the help of others. We do too.
3, know our faith tradition's understanding of suicide and what we believe. What does your faith tradition teach regarding suicide? Do you agree with that tradition? If not, what is your faith-based understanding about suicide? When you can, explore some of the current theological and pastoral perspectives on suicide. A lot has changed for many faith traditions in the last decades. Even those traditions that once regarded suicide as a sin no longer see it as a moral failure, but as a result of a crisis, mental illness, or a combination of factors.
4, be honest with the leadership of our faith communities about our need for deep self-care in the wake of a death by suicide. They need to know the particular stresses we face in such situations, and they have a responsibility to advocate for us. It is in their best interest that we take time to care for ourselves and stay healthy.
5, be honest with God. However we pray, in silence or aloud, sitting or kneeling, writing in a journal or going for a walk, we need to tell God what we are feeling. God is big enough, strong enough, and loving enough to deal with whatever grief, guilt, anger, or despair we may have. We need to make time and space to be held by that strength and enfolded in that love.
Finally, connect with life. Suicide brings us face to face with the depth and despair of death. Like family members, friends, and other survivors of a suicide loss, we have to make a conscious commitment to life once again. Each of us will do that in different ways. Our individual or community spiritual practices, hiking, gardening, journaling, creating art, making music, cooking, being with children, taking time with friends. How we do it isn't what matters. That we do it in healthy ways is essential.
As faith leaders and colleagues, we know the burdens you carry and the challenges you face, especially in caring for others following a death by suicide. We hope this video has been helpful. For more information, please check out the Faith, Hope, Life website with the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. Most of all, please know that you and your faith communities are held in our prayers as together we share in this ministry of faith, hope, and life. Blessings.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I think it's a good way to bring us to wrap up by just looking this and look at it in the face here. What are we dealing with when we take on other people's distress? And it really is a trauma exposure response. There is a fantastic book, I'm holding it up now, Trauma Stewardship. This is Laura Van Der Noot-Lipsky with Connie Burke. This book, as you can tell, I use it a lot. This is for people who deal with hard conversations every day. And I think other people's trauma can take its toll on us. If you look at her model here, we go through waves of feelings when we take so much on, like a sense that we can't do enough or hypervigilance. We may become numb sometimes. We may struggle with our own addictions. We may have guilt for not being able to make things right for someone. So keep this in mind. This is a lot of heavy to carry with you. And I am recommending that you read her book because it gives you some practices on how to care for yourself in this. And I want to do a couple of those to end up our conversation today. Let's see if I can get it to move on forward. Okay. That's her book. She talks about finding your way to trauma stewardship. Here's an example of an activity that she wants you to do. I want you to take a moment and literally stop. Ask yourself about your vocation. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Then remember, you're making a choice to do this work. Take a deep breath. Breathe in both the responsibility and the freedom of that acknowledgement. I want you to try that in this moment. Now, at the beginning and end of each of your days, take a moment to think of one thing that you are grateful for. I know all of you probably already do this, but be really intentional. Every day, think of one person you're grateful for or one thing. And take the lead in thanking others. As a faith leader, you take the lead in thanking will help others spread the word. So if you can put one person or one thing that you're grateful for today in the chat box, that would be really good. I love seeing these come through. What a beautiful list. And to wrap it up too, I would like for you to put on a scrap of paper. This is just for you. What can you let go tonight? Think about one thing that I can put down on a piece of paper that I will not carry with me for another single day. And tonight, before you go to bed, crumple up that scrap of paper with that thing on it and literally throw it away. Finally, ask yourself what your ancestors and those who have raised you have done throughout time to heal themselves and others. When they experience trauma, how did they go on? Now, I know to you guys, religion does this all the time. For social workers, for first responders reading this trauma stewardship book, it may be something that some of them haven't thought about much. So I encourage you to continue doing this. I want to thank you for your time today, you guys. And I want to open with Miss Casey and any questions you may have with remaining time.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been so awesome. And it's just so encouraging to me that we have so many people here gathered wanting to learn more to better serve their communities. That's what I'm extra grateful for today.
Me too.
If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to send them in the chat now. We're going to wrap up, and so I invite you, if you have those questions, you can stick around. But I just want to give closing information to everyone so that if anybody has to run off to something else, then you have this info. So everyone, you will see that Shannon just sent a survey in the chat. We ask that you would fill that out. We love getting your thoughts on these webinars and the work that we're doing as a collaborative. It helps us to plan for the future and invite great speakers like Rebecca when we know what you want. It helps us. So please fill that out. Also, Rebecca referenced the resource guide a lot in her presentation, and Rebecca has shared so many resources today, so it's really important to us that you have access to all of those. Shannon has already sent that link and the password to that to access that in the chat, but she's going to do it again, I think, so that you all can have access to that. There's a lot of good stuff. We've got books and videos, scripture, documents. I mean, there's everything in there, so make sure you check that out. Like I said, we're going to close out now, but you can stay on if you have questions. You can ask them yourself or send it in the chat. And I just want to thank you all again for being here, and especially thank you to Rebecca. This was a phenomenal presentation, and we're really grateful that you're here.
Thanks, everybody.